Good morning. Today we're going to talk about seed starting mix. Seed starting mix is different from potting soil because seed starting mix generally has more of a fluffiness to it. It doesn't have as large size pieces in it. And that allows the seeds to start more easily and gives their roots plenty of space to move. And when they're young, if you've ever seen a little seed that's just starting to sprout, quite often you'll see that there's just so many tiny little filaments coming off of it. And you need to give those filaments space. And if you don't, then the seed will have a harder time starting. So seed starting mix should be different from potting mix. And today I'm going to tell you what I use for a seed starting mix. A lot of people will tell you that theirs is the best recipe, and mine is possibly not the best recipe, but it's a recipe that works for me, has worked for me in the past, and it's made out of things that I have on hand, so it's a good recipe for me. And having used it for several years, I'm confident enough to say that if you use it, it will probably work for you too. That said, you could probably take seeds and start them in sand, depending on the seed, and they would still start. So seed starting mix really isn't there to give the seed the nutrient that it's going to need for its entire life. It's just there to get it started, and then you will repot it into something else with potting soil that will have composted manure or leaves or what have you, things in it that have nutrient for the plant to then take and use to become healthy and strong. So here's the thing, you can start, and yesterday I was talking about peat pellets. You can start seeds in peat moss, which is essentially a sterile medium that really doesn't have all that much in it for in nutrient value, but it does have enough space for the roots to get around, and they do just well in just plain peat. So if that's what you've got, you can use that, or you can make something a little bit more complex, like what I have. So I'm going to tell you my complex recipe. A lot of people will tell you that they've got the best recipe ever. My recipe is good, and that's about what I'll say about it. In any case, it needs to be sterile. So you should not make seed starting mix out of anything that is not kept relatively clean. And so the two main ingredients in my seed starting mix are two things that are sterile enough so that you are unlikely to get fungus and other seeds and things like that that are left in it. So it's a good way to start with something that you know is clean. Otherwise, if you use soil from outside, you will have something that is probably more likely to mold and might contain seeds of other plants. So you might be confused when you see something come up and you might think, oh, that's my tomato, but it's actually something else. So that's really important. And as for the ingredients themselves, this is what I use. But I tend to use peat moss, and that's because I bought a huge bale of this stuff before I realized that it's not as renewable a resource as like coconut coir. So I might shift next time I purchase to coconut coir. I've read reviews of coconut coir versus peat moss, and have seen some people who've said that they prefer peat moss, even though it's not quite as renewable. It is a renewable resource, but it's not renewing as quickly as we're taking out of the ground. So then another ingredient that I use is vermiculite. And people are suspicious of vermiculite because vermiculite used to, the way that it was produced, it used to actually sometimes contain asbestos. And so that can be a concern. These days, from what I understand, that is not the case. And so I also have a big bag of vermiculite that I use for storing seeds and cold stratification. So since I've got that on hand, it's a handy addition to my my mixture. And that also is a medium that, just like with the peat moss, the vermiculite holds moisture in, and it can provide space for roots to take, to get around and to spread out. There are, in addition to these two main ingredients, there are a couple of other things that I add. I have added in the past calcium carbonate. Calcium is also something that plants eventually will need, so the plants will, over time, end up needing this calcium as they grow. I don't know if they really use much of it in the very beginning stages, but I put it in there. It doesn't hurt, and it will be probably useful to the plant later. But it's useful now in that since I'm using peat moss, the calcium carbonate helps to bring up the pH and make it less acidic. And the last thing that I started adding this year, and I'm just adding this because it was an idea that I got by doing a little bit of research about what other people add to their seed starting mix, and that is I'm using magnesium carbonate. And so I'll give you the whole recipe in just a second, but the magnesium carbonate, magnesium is also something in the magnesium carbonate form that plants can access and use for growth. They may not need it right now as tiny little seedlings, but as they grow, they'll benefit from that. So anyway, those are the four main ingredients, and then there's water. And so I'll give you the proportions of all of this. So first off, I only make as much of this as I need at any given time because I'm going to get it damp right away. And so I'll keep it for a month or so, but I don't keep it mixed like this for a long time, and in its damp state I try to keep everything dry until I need it. So the peat moss is a very, very dusty substance. The vermiculite's also kind of dusty, but not as dusty as the peat moss. So you want to wear a mask when you're making this, just for the nuisance factor. You probably don't want to be breathing in all the dust from the peat moss as you're mixing it. And I mix it in a 5-gallon bucket, and I mix it by hand. So I'll start by putting in 8 quarts of the peat moss, and make sure that as I do that, I break it up into its smallest bits, and any large bits I take and remove. Then what I do is I take my, and so that's 8 quarts, and then I will take 2 tablespoons of the calcium carbonate, one teaspoon of the magnesium carbonate, and I'll mix that in next. I'm still mixing it dry. Okay, I'm still mixing it dry to make sure everything gets mixed together well before we add water, because once you start adding water, you end up clumping things together. Then I add 2 quarts of vermiculite on top of it all in this 5-gallon bucket. And I mix that all. And when this is all really well mixed, so that you look at it and you can see a consistent speckling through the whole thing. You've scraped around the bottom edge, you've scraped in the middle, you've brought everything up to the top and mixed it around, so it's all consistent. Then I start adding my water. So for this amount, and this is when I'm starting with everything really bone dry, the amount of water that I add is, and I add it by the quart, I add 2.5 quarts of water. So I will add a quart of water, I'll mix it, usually just with one hand, because I can mix this amount with one hand and get it really well mixed. If I did twice this, I wouldn't be able to mix it well enough. So I'll mix this amount, and then I'll add another quart of water, mix it again, and then I'll add my final 1/2 quart of water. At any point along this process where you think that you've got enough dampness in the mix, you can stop. And you might find that after a day or so, it seems to be a little drier, and that might be because the peat moss has pulled in more of the moisture, and you can add a little bit more water at that time, or you might find that it's handy to, to work with it like that, and then add a little bit more water after you're done start putting your seeds into little pots, or however you choose to put them together. Hi, Chester. Gonna let my cat out. So that is the recipe, and I will actually repeat that for you right now so you've got it all in one place. It is 8 quarts of peat moss, 2 tablespoons of calcium carbonate, and I'm going to tell you in an upcoming episode, probably tomorrow, how I make my own calcium carbonate, which is interesting thing. You definitely have the ingredients for it at home. 1 tablespoon of magnesium carbonate, and I actually have a powdered supplement that I take, and so I just use that. We'll see how well it works. I think it probably will work fine because it's pure magnesium carbonate, and that's what other people have suggested who know more than I do about mixing up things with peat moss. And 2 quarts of vermiculite and 2.5 quarts of water. So that's your recipe. 8 quarts peat moss, 2 tablespoons calcium carbonate, 1 tablespoon magnesium carbonate, 2 quarts of vermiculite, 2.5 quarts of water. And that's what I use. So give it a try if you're interested. And like I say, these recipes, people will tell you they've got the best recipe. Plants are pretty flexible at the seedling stage when they're just popping out. What they really want is just enough space to move. And when you transplant them into a larger pot, then you need to think about what's in my potting soil, what are the nutrients that I need for the plants that I'm growing. And I buy my potting soil, and I try different ones every year. I don't have a particular favorite, but I would love to hear if you do. So if you have another mix that you would like to talk about, please put it in the comments below. Really appreciate a thumbs up, and I would really appreciate it if you would subscribe. I hope to hear from you either here or on Instagram, which would be @FoodForestGardenClub. And you can also find me at the website, which is foodforestgardenclub.org. We're still putting it together, but it's getting there. So anyway, appreciate you joining me this morning. Look forward to seeing you again soon.